Right? You have made it to the fourth and final series of the DocuSeries. We're going to start from IATSE and show you a unique experience of the African American um, craftsmen as they travel from history up until now. So I hope you enjoy. There is a paucity of in-depth information on Black designers, stagehands, dressers, stage managers, and various producers and directors in the 20th century. American theater, even though these Black artists and craftspeople have played a major role in the development of American theater, these non-performers encountered a tremendous amount of discrimination and segregation during the first half of the century. All over the country, the non-performing Black was usually prohibited from working in theaters even when the Black performer was on stage. A typical victim of this racial oppression was the Black stagehand. At the turn of the century, when Blacks were performing on Broadway, and then again after the success of Shuffle Along, which marked the return of Blacks to Broadway in 1921, the Black stagehand was nowhere to be found, backstage on the Great White Way. Between 1910 and 1920 was a unique period when Blacks produced, directed, wrote, and staged shows performed in Black theaters, many of which were owned by Blacks before Black audiences. In short, it was a period when Blacks had a significant measure of control over every aspect of their production. With the advent and growing popularity of the motion pictures in the 1920s, the legitimate theater began to slide downhill, not only for Blacks, but for whites as well. Movies were much less expensive than live theater, with theater virtually becoming a form of recreation for the elite. Another blow for the Black producer and theater owner was the onset of the Great Depression, and finally the Great Crash of 1929, which resulted in many Black theaters being sold or closed. Of all the artists to experience the effects of the Depression, the worst off were the show people, unable to compete with the motion picture industry. Actors, stagehands, technicians, musicians, and vaudeville performers found themselves displaced by technology even before the crash. Sound film replaced the orchestra. Mechanical music replaced musicians. Actors were eclipsed by Hollywood's star system, and stagehands and stage mechanics were no longer needed. Professional theater people were stranded without work in major cities all over the country. While all of this was taking place in the 20s, the Technical Theater Union was gaining a stronghold in American theater. The International Alliance of Theatrical Staging Employees and Moving Picture Operators of the United States and Canada, commonly known as IATSE, or the IA, had and still does have jurisdiction over major theaters, TV studios, and movie houses in the United States and Canada. This union, through its various locals, supplies stagehands, projectionists, wardrobe assistants, sound technicians, and various other technical personnel. First organized in 1886 in New York, the IA did not become an international union until 1893. The IA, which at its inception was restricted to whites, has for years had the reputation of being father-son organization. According to Dole Thomas, one of the first Blacks to join the IA in Washington, D.C. The Constitution and bylaws of the IA up until the 20s stated in a nice way, instead of blatant language, no Negroes. This organization is for white males only. Thomas also indicated that Blacks had attempted for years to join the Union, but that the IA Constitution had always prevented them from doing so. Thomas, who started working as a projectionist, electrician, and stagehand in the theaters in and around Washington, D.C., as early as 1910 in the Old Howard Theater, points out that it wasn't until 1918 that the first Black local was organized in the country in Washington, D.C. Its local was 224A, which started as a projectionist union and eventually became a mixed local of projectionists and stagehands in the early 20s. Whites established Black auxiliary, or A locals, to prevent Blacks and whites from working together and receiving the same benefits. This A local like the ones to come, was governed by the white or parent local, to which to which dues were paid. After this group received union status, it encouraged Black stagehands around the country to do the same. And A locals eventually emerged in such cities as Philadelphia, St. Louis, Norfolk, New Orleans, Chicago, and so forth. Washington, D.C.'s local was, however, to remain the largest and one of the strongest of the Black locals at this time. Blacks in New York City were still trying to obtain IA status. When Blacks would bring up the issue of joining the local, number one, to the executive members, the issue was either tabled or dropped for more important business. Kenyon, on April 8th, 1935, under the administration of Franklin D. Roosevelt, started the Congress organized the Work Progress Administration, which was to help solve the problems of people and of work. And out of the WPA was born the Federal Theater Project. The Federal Theater Project in 1935 through 1939 was designed to reverse the aristocratic posture of earlier theatrical operations in this country. Challenging theater tradition in several ways, the FTP was particularly bold in its plan to make drama available to the masses for this time. The FTP was a godsend for the numerous Black stagehands and other theater artists and craftsmen out of work. For the FTP provided these craftsmen an opportunity to work under expert professionals in professional theater spaces and with some of the latest equipment on the market. Through the FTP, several Negro units were set up around the country, the largest and most successful being the New York unit at the Lafayette Theater in Harlem, where such plays as Macbeth, Haiti, and Atrocities, and the Lion were produced. Blacks learned the art of stage lighting, scenery, and Perry Watkins, Broadway's first Black union designer, courtesy of the National Archives, costume design. Out of this same unit came Byron Webb and designer Perry Watkins. With the aid of the FTP, Perry Watkins became the first Black to join a designers union, known as the United Scenic Arts, USA. And in 1939, he designed his first Broadway show, Mamba's Daughters, starring Ethel Waters. The FTP was also instrumental in assisting Black stagehands to get their local number IA charter in 1937. Henry Kenyon states, a lot of the scenery we used that we didn't make had to be handled by local number one. So in order to handle it, we would have to be affiliated with number one before we could work in the theater. So we became an auxiliary, which was local number 1A. Blacks were confined to specific areas or specific jurisdiction during these auxiliaries. For local number 1A, it was above 110th Street and in certain areas in the Bronx. With the abrupt closing of the FTP in 1939, Blacks found themselves with union status, but there were fewer places to work in Harlem. During the 40s and the 50s, many theaters were being closed, torn down, converted to churches, and the like. Some stagehands worked the Apollo, which was the only major theater in Harlem, and a few worked the various movie houses as electricians and maintenance men in 1955. Two executive members of local number 1A took their complaint to the New York State Division of Human Rights, which was headed by Commissioner Elmer A. Carter, a former FTP officer. Negro stagehands were required to apply for membership only to local number 1A, and that local number one, ever since its organization in 1886, has remained exclusively white. On the basis of all the facts and circumstances adduced by the investigation, the investigating commissioner found that probable cause existed to credit the allegations of the complaints and then proceeded to conference, conciliation, and persuasion with the object of accomplishing the dissolution of local number 1A as a segregated local, the very existence of which, together with the restrictions and discrimination against its members because of their race, constituted a violation of the law. Under the terms of such agreement, local number 1A was dissolved, and at one of the largest meetings held in years by local number one, the members of local number 1A were by unanimous vote approved for membership in Local Number 1 with full and equal rights, benefits, and privileges. On June 25th, 1955, 30 IA members became members of Local Number 1. Of this group, 24 were Black, 3 Puerto Ricans, and 3 whites. The whites in the IA had worked the union houses in Harlem before the inception of the IA, but decided to remain and work under their jurisdiction. Local Number 1A was not, however, the first segregated local to merge with a parent or white local. Chicago was one of the first to merge, and in the 20s, and the last local to merge was number 224A in Washington, D.C. in the fall of 1981. The first Broadway production was worked by Black stagehands was Jamaica, 1957, which starred Lena Horne. Home and the Coordinating Council of the Negro Performers were mainly responsible for the stagehands' presence. Many of these stagehands, such as John Kenner Jr., would later venture into television industry, and Raleigh Banks became an executive of the IA. Between 1955 and 1960, no new Blacks or Puerto Ricans had received membership to the union, but a total of 300 whites had joined during the same period. By 1968, with 1,400 members, there were only 20 Blacks and 6 Puerto Ricans. The solution to increase minority membership were to publicly announce the date, time, and place for the union exam. To add more minorities to the waiting list, and for the union office to inform the state division of all new openings in the apprenticeship workshop. In December 1968, 2 Blacks were added to the union. The history of Blacks in the technical unions is a very complex and interesting one, with research still in an early stage. The reasons for continuing absence of Blacks in the unions are still being investigated today. This concludes our docuseries. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you will stay tuned for the video that comes in the following. This will be some of our legends and pioneers who entered the union and carried us up to 2020. We got some live interviews, so I hope you will join us for that. And now I will be available for question and answering. So Q&A time, let's go.